Well, welcome to the new Kevin Smith, The Great Witness Show. The new adventure series is. I'm Dean Val here with Dean Kevin, the star of the show, and welcome, Kevin, and welcome your experiences, and let's see what's going on today with those and how we can become more aware. Thank you for being here.
This real side experience would begin with me in the company of another individual, a woman, and although I would be unable to identify her based on her visual surface appearance, I had the impression that she was perhaps a real guide. With the personal self alone, all we would have would be the visual, literal, simulated surface view, and every surface view visual is the effect of a created idea, and the effect may look a certain way, but not always is the nature of the idea that created it very apparent if all we have through the personal self is the visual effect to draw our conclusions from. For you can't have an effect without that which created it, as everything created, everything brought into effect actuality, must be through the body vehicles of a created self, as only through the activation of their mechanics can created effects become so, as is the nature of a creation. And so the origin of an idea effected stems from a consciousness, and the particular way it is constructed, its general intent, inclination, etc. As the way a consciousness is, will very much have ideas that reflect its nature. A controlling inclined consciousness will always then produce idea creations based on this intent, and they will look however they do on the surface. If they are designed to trawl agreement to what are in fact then controlling intended ideas, they may look a certain way to glean that agreement, but then the effects of such will be according to the reality of the idea and will show up eventually. Everything must reveal itself as it actually is, regardless of how it looks on the surface. And if we agree with individuals or certain created ideas, they may appear a certain way, or be packaged and marketed that seem as beneficial, but the effects of agreement always reflect what the ideas in reality actually are. The ideas that are the individual and their consciousness design, and the ideas we agree with. And so, when it comes to individuals, their body forms, or the forms they are assuming, are effected from a consciousness, and however that is constructed. But this will be a consciousness of ideas and intentionality that the personal self can't see, but a consciousness of ideas taken on, if agreement is extended regardless. And with an idea, as I said, it must be accompanied with that which created it, the projector of the effect, the consciousness of the individual whose idea it was. And so, as we take on and incorporate these ideas, as we agree to them, we also take on all the ideas of the consciousness that created them. A complete idea package, like a large download to our computer, where what seemed a single file has all manner of other unseen files, unseen to the personal self, attached with it. Our real awareness, which is a part of this all-aliveness awareness that is everything, that is then through all consciousness, has access to everything that brought forth all the surface effected visual simulations. It has the overview of every idea that birthed the effects, every consciousness and its decided design, and every idea, thought, intent, and emotion currently in activation through all consciousness. And so, regardless of the surface, personal self, simulated view, we have additional real awareness impressions afforded that allow us instant determination of the sincerity and intent of an individual, and indeed of the idea simulations we come across. We can, for example, determine then the fake dark force universities from the genuine ones without needing to go through the experience of being hoodwinked and taplined through a deceptive dark force creation, and rather than finding out the hard way. For as I said, regardless of the surface presented and marketed front, everything must reveal itself as it actually is, because the nature of the simulator is that we are the effects of that which we take on, and anything, any idea, cannot be anything other than what it is, and so all deception must show up, as the effects will reveal the true nature of the ideas we have agreed to, and indeed the actual intent and sincerity of the individuals we extend agreement and open up to also. So with this real awareness overview, we rather have the ability to sidestep what we otherwise would have walked into, experienced, and learned the hard way as to the controlling and adverse ideas we had in fact agreed to. And so the real awareness is rather then similar to our computer virus detection software. As we encounter certain ideas that seem beneficial on the surface, our real awareness determines that the idea is unsafe, that it comes with malicious, additional, and unseen to the personal self, ideas, just as the websites we have clicked on may have sneaky viruses attached, etc., and we are warned by our virus detecting computer software. And the real awareness then can equally determine a real guide from a personal self-immersed individual or any individual between these two positions. As a personal self-immersed individual will, of course, be nothing other than within their own consciousness of ideas, and this can be determined through the real awareness. An individual like a guide who stands in the true reality of their real awareness, isness position, and operates always in ways that support life and all awareness, will be operating through a simulated vehicle also, as we encounter them on the real side, so they must have exacted a consciousness that can then effect this body form into a simulation. But naturally, the difference between such a consciousness compared with that of a personal self-absorbed individual would be very discernible. But again, the personal self alone would always only have just the visual, simulated body vehicle effect to consider by, and the dark forces do often thrust forth fake guides, etc., but the ears recognizing and standing position the guides have is such that can't be faked, and the deceptive guide mimicking a controller would indeed be personal self-consciousness absorbed, and this will be then very apparent to the real awareness, as it will read the ideas the fake guide is activating, including the controlling consciousness intent. But anyway, accompanied by this guide, we would be going seemingly door to door, although on the real side the representation would be that we were approaching individuals via their personal selves that houses on the real side represent. For yes, it is a constant that we are approaching all throughout multi-dimensional creation, and the approach always begins with the personal self, as the personal self must always decide. The personal self must establish its real awareness reconnection, but until that time, the personal self is rather self-isolated from its true being, and so it is the personal selves we must initially approach. Generally then, we are extending always the opportunity of the ears, and the option to re-establish this real awareness connection that the personal self must decide, and then that this filters through to the physical, and they are motivated to consciously decide their process of awareness. It's one thing to glean agreement on the unseen levels and parts of the individual, but the entirety of the personal self rather has to get on board with it. They must consciously agree also, and with most, what they are conscious or aware of is rather limited to the physical level. So always it is the effort to get anything through to the physical level. Everything starts on the real side, but very often doesn't reach the densest level of creation. As individuals can be so physical level, one-dimensional, that little or anything transpiring on the other dimensions and the real side of themselves can reach them, and yet everything does start on the unseen dimensions. It's just a question of if it can filter through. But in theory, those ready for the opportunity will be more open. Their real awareness will be deciding to want to recognize the ears, and will be nudging its isolated, personal, detached self. So the personal self will at that moment be far more receptive to the hints that draw them to the real references on the physical that facilitate their process of awareness to begin. And so here we were, going from house to house, personal self to personal self. Our efforts were extensive, and who knew how many individuals we approached? I saw but fractions of it, but it is a continuous effort with all who are stepping up, and now and again the personal self is shown these glimpses, almost as a verification that our promoting of the ears is relentless on the real side, even if the personal self is not always shown. It was interesting that the individuals we approached could see me, but not the real guide. This would be due to how all consciousness affecting the overall simulator arena presents then as rather an open game arena, with all the various additional idea creations that are made effect manifest within it. And so, regardless of our unique individual world of illusions, all consciousness shares certain ideas that effect into the overall foundation simulator, and even a single idea shared must have then a shared effect simulation experience. And so, for an individual whose consciousness is a part of a certain simulator, all the individuals whose consciousness also intertwine to effect that simulator are accessible, as all parts make up the whole. All consciousness makes up the simulator. Ideas shared throughout the consciousness present as an overall shared simulator game arena where no one is beyond approach. We just must work around the additional obstacles agreed upon that are built within the overall game. Some individuals may be positioned in easy to access open areas. Some may be locked in tall, ominous towers, so to speak. But with real guides, even though they must construct a consciousness vehicle to effect a simulated idea of themselves, it is a consciousness, not a part of any consciousness collective, that effects into any simulator. And so they can move unboundless through all creations, but always outside of them, so to speak, and only can they directly feature in the experience of individuals whose consciousnesses are part of simulator effecting. If they have direct agreement, this can be so. As with any idea, as we agree to it, we incorporate it into the consciousness, which then has the effects featuring, and this would include the idea that a consciousness-generated body vehicle represents, and so the guides rather need to be promoted, their existence made apparent, that until they are rather unable to feature in anyone's experience. But once agreed to, so it's as though their consciousness effecting body vehicle avatar now is uploaded to the agreeable individual's game, and the guide can feature through this avatar and provide then the real side experiences, etc. And so this seemed rather the case here. I was able to access these individuals by virtue of my consciousness being a part of theirs, which effected into a shared simulated arena, and so I would be approaching them. And beside me was this other individual, this guide, that like all the guides would engage with the individuals and their simulation as soon as permission agreement is granted and access then can be attained. And as you can imagine, some individuals allowed me to enter their homes, some did not. Some slammed the door in my face, representing the varying degrees of success in regards to how agreeable these individuals were or not to beginning their awareness processes. And as we might imagine, with agreement gleaned, these individuals may then begin to venture forth from their consciousness representing houses and onto the real side beyond, the place they need to be to receive the real side guide created experiences, which are aside from their consciousness and however it is constructed. The personal self house represents the consciousness. It must then be a part of all consciousness personal self houses that effect the overall simulator and all dimensional levels. So, through awareness, can the full extent of the house be explored. symbolically representing the exploration of creation, but still the individual is resigned to the simulation according to their consciousness and the collective consciousness they are intertwined with. Real guide experiences, if created and not already created simulation that is available through the overall consciousness, will be then simulation that is aside from the overall consciousness affected simulator of dimensional life levels. And like the universities, they don't feature in the simulator arena that affected from the consciousness, but in a simulation aside from the consciousness. That requires we leave the consciousness representing houses to experience. On a few occasions, despite my access to houses being denied, I would actually warp through the closed doors and into the houses regardless. For despite perhaps consciously not in agreement with others that would deny our encroaching on their experience, there always is much by way of unconscious agreement which dictates otherwise, and the real awareness will discern when such, what seems to be, abrasive, imposing measures makes sense. That it's not a case of just barging in because we can, through subconscious agreements, but perhaps things are of a particular where, although on the surface the individual seems disagreeable and resistant, it is perhaps so they need a little nudge, just to shake off a few self-limiting, personal stubborn attitudes. For after all, this is the real purpose for every being, if they realize it or not, that of becoming more aware and recognizing the ease. And for some, they are just about ready or thereabouts, but still a few ideas they cling to that hold them from taking the leap, like stage fright, and all that is needed is to rather thrust them onto the stage, and then they are fine, and indeed are rather glad they were pulled onto the stage, as they couldn't quite bring themselves to do so. Ultimately, we can't drag people into their awareness processes. They do have to decide, and to keep deciding, but sometimes with individuals standing at the precipice of indecision, they need another factor or variable to have them decide one way or the other, and after all, it is for their overall benefit. I also had an audience with an individual that I impressioned as being very influential amidst the Native American Indians, as I was allowed into the personal self-house of this Native American. And the Native Americans do have quite the innumerable connections throughout creation with all manner of other beings and body forms, and so, should their agreements be secured, agreements to their awareness processes, and also the galactic activities, this would be very instrumental in the ramifications for all life that reverberate throughout creation. And although they have their attitudes where the white people are concerned, and understandably enough, all they are doing is restricting themselves with a distortion, and they then are forfeiting their awareness opportunities. In a way, then, they are almost punishing themselves through a decided and clung to emotional attitude response to situations that transpired in a creational experience, and that which is then keeping them in a perpetual state of limitation and restriction. But a number of real side experiences have revealed, that I have shared, that a continuous engaging with the Native Americans has them slowly opening up, and this experience was a further indication, as I would have my audience with an individual that represented them, and he exuded no attitudes, suspicions, or reservations whatsoever. And indeed, we would be exchanging items. I was unable to remember exactly what they were, but I'm fairly certain he gave me one of those Native American smoking pipes, and we might construe this as an exchanging of ideas that evidently then we each accepted, or more literally it may represent an exchange of gifts that suggested tokens or gestures of good will or sincerity. There was another brief scene where, in an altogether different theme, I would be observing the unfolding situation from my real awareness aside from creation overview. For we can interject ourselves into the simulated experiences if we agree with the ideas contained within it, the various individuals, etc., if appropriate to do so, if we need, say, get their personal self-attentions, or through the real awareness that is through all consciousness and all simulation effected from it, can we be shown anything that is taking place now, that the real awareness allows its personal self to see, and evidently then it is something significant and to be shared. And from this position, this aside from creation, real awareness view, we can be shown anything simulated. For despite the individuality of all consciousness personal selves, it is ultimately this one overall everything isness awareness that is through it all, and so from that real awareness position we have full access, like having a room full of every consciousness vehicle represented by a TV set, and we just pick and choose which TV set and the consciousness affecting movie that is playing on the screen we wish to see, and only should we agree with that which is contained in the TV movie are we then transferred into the movie and feature in it amidst all that's taking place. But then, at any time, we can remove that agreement and exit the TV movie and return to this primary position, the room with all the TV sets, representing all the individual consciousnesses, and this real awareness creational overview. But anyway, on a previous real side experience, I had shared how I would witness dark force individuals, those that represented extremely highly placed positions within the dark force overall hierarchical control structure, and so would be very influential naturally. For the dictates of the Kalom God filter through all the levels of control and play out then into the experience of all those affected through the agreements they have ultimately extended to the Kalom. And so we can see that with a pyramid structure of control, with the Kalom at the top, the higher in the pyramid an individual is placed, the more they have influence, as their dictates are executed through all positions below them. And on that experience, these dark force characters were jostling and justifying their assumptions of as high a position as they could claim, for indeed the dark force group in question seemed to represent the top 5 or so. And so a restructuring of a pecking order of perhaps some of the most influential and agreement on a vast scale swinging individuals must surely effect alterations to overall simulator experience on just as vast a scale. Or maybe not, just as political parties change, and yet the agenda and overall direction of human control remains the same. But then the political parties have various tiers of control above them, and these 5 individuals were the very top controllers, as were my impressions. Pretty much then, all they would answer to would be the Kalom himself. But anyway, this recent real side glimpse seemed to be a continuation of this highly placed controller positioning jostling, as were my impressions, presented now as though a kind of tournament, like a pack of wolves challenging each other for the assumption of a greater positioning within the pack's hierarchy. And it was rather entertaining to behold, as all those involved, these dark force characters of significance, were bringing all manner of magical abilities to bear, and rather duking it out in combat, It literally looked like something from that computer game and movie Mortal Kombat, what with all the fireballs being hurled, lightning strikes back and forth, etc. And eventually it seemed that through this decided means of determining rank within the top echelons of dark force control structure, that the pecking order was finally resolved. And then another being entered the scene, dressed all in black and metallic armor. He reminded me a little of Darth Vader in his appearance, but more so like that character from a computer game called EverQuest, a character called ReALLS. There was a hush that befell these dark force, magic wielding individuals, and my impression was that this individual may well have been the Calorm himself, as he evidently wasn't here to interject himself into this tournament. He was naturally then the top dog, and no one here would even consider challenging him. And it's interesting that on the few occasions when I have encountered the Calorm, he has dressed this way, all in black and sporting a black helmet, that nothing of his face could be perceived. And in fact, in the game EverQuest, the ReALLS character was the top god that resided on the god planes, the dimensions beyond the mortal worlds, and he also had been designed that he was dressed in black metallic garments and wearing a black helmet. So always in games, movies, etc., are hints and indications of that which is in reality so. But regardless of it being the Calorm or not, he, or the others that had jostled for the top positions beneath him, could not see me, as I retained my real awareness position and aside from creation view. And so this tournament seemed to finally settle who was to assume which controller position, and perhaps we will see how this plays out in creation, if indeed it changes anything or not.
And yes, each one of these experiences of yours is a movie and will be such. And so, yes, again, they see what we're doing. It's all over. And with everything coming into focus here with the world and just everywhere in creation, it's very, very interesting. But this is the new nowness. And this is the part that, it really agitates people because they don't know what it is. They can't figure it out. It's an unknown. So they, again, cling to their old routines. And many people go back to their religions and whatever because they don't know. They don't know. They won't take the risk. And it is taking the risk, stepping up and just going through the process and continuing on until you figure it out. And so I like the door-to-door thing. That's interesting. Yes, on the real side too, it's not easy because you see the attitudes of people. And just like here, when it comes into their physical awareness or presence here, it's very difficult for them. And so, we're doing all we can. But one of the things is, as we start this new show with you, Val, and I, we're going to start at the basics for people. And the basics is that people have been launched into so much misinformation that they think that they're, in a way, spreading something that is essential or whatever, but for the most part, no. Because of how we each have been raised and literalized this lifetime, basically what we're sharing with most people is from that literalization and not from a real awareness point of view. And so this is the new nowness, and very few people will get it unless they really take the risk. So again, thank you, Kevin, for doing this. It's so cool. Here we go, onward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, like Dwayne says, everything equals itself. So causes become effects, and whatever you create, it's going to come about. I mean, the way it equals the creation or the cause, it's going to just equal itself. So it helps if we put our attention and efforts outside of creation. Otherwise, we're just being recycled with the same old ideas and thoughts and attitudes. And we just keep coming back for more nonsense. So what we're pointing people to is something outside of creation, outside this cause and effect world, into something that's just, it's an isness, it just is. So again, everything, like you say, well, we are the effects of that which we take on, and it's also the effects of the agreements we make with others, people, organizations, ideas. Those all affect us too if we accept and agree to those things or ideas or people. We literally take those things on too, if not consciously, subconsciously. So again, we're pointing people to outside of this cause and effect cycle or mechanism that just, that has been created for us to become more aware with. But as it is, people just take it as reality and not as a reference. And then the Native Americans, we're working with some Native Americans right now with the CSPOA. One woman, it's a woman. You had an experience with a man, but this woman we're working with, she seems not to have the attitude of the Native Americans, many of which do have this attitude of kind of victim. But she's taking it on to do something, and I'm glad to see you working with this fellow and see where that goes, because these people do have a connection with different entities and spirits and resources that normally the white man doesn't, because he's more into nature. So he has these connections, again, not necessarily consciously, but subconsciously through his agreement with that culture. So it's very interesting. And again, thank you for the thorough explanation of how this all works and articulating it so well. Thanks, Kevin.
There was a series of real side experiences that spanned several nights, and although some ran in a sequence, they didn't seem to be connected. Of all that I experienced, some of it more personal self-orientated, and the working through the created self and its tap lines, etc. One experience stuck out as more shareable here, more relevant as a galactic real side experience. I found myself in a dark, gloomy setting. I was with a large group of individuals of the more aware persuasion, and there was a woman who presented as the leader of our group. She had a strong awareness, and perhaps was indeed a guide, or an individual not far from such a standing that a real guide has with life. We seemed to be in some kind of temple, carved out of the very rock of an underground cave system. It had the feeling of great age, and was very dimly illuminated. I'm uncertain where we were exactly. We may have been underground on the earth, perhaps, or underground on any number of worlds. This created temple was definitely very ancient, and my impression was that it hadn't been utilized for eons. The idea seemed to be that wherever we were was a place where a race of beings could be connected with, but only in this temple, as somehow it had been constructed at a point where there was a kind of dimensional frequency weak point, a thin place between dimensions, and as is very often the case, these locations, when determined, have structures built upon them for the purpose of manipulating creation to weaken the veil more, so that connection can be made with the other dimension that is only a frequency fraction away from the one such temples or buildings are built upon. So it was then that these beings we sought existed in a different dimension, fractionally removed from the one we were in frequency terms, and this temple represented a kind of a bridge between the two. It wasn't just a case of being here, that our mere presence would be enough to establish this contact with these other dimensional beings, but that certain activities had to be performed to weaken the veil further, so to speak, that would allow these beings the ability to manifest here. The woman leader of our group had the knowledge and ability of how this was accomplished, and as for the rest of the group and I, we all would lay down, and we placed our created consciousness of thought and emotion aside, and moved into our real awareness, as it seemed this was essential for all those present here to do, for this process to be successful. It reminded me a little, and had a similar feel to it, of how, when I am on the physical, and I practice standing in the being isness nowness state of my real awareness as I lay in my bed, that often I find myself between the real side and the physical with my awareness view, a between state bridging the real side and the physical. And so, as I lay there with my eyes closed, in the nowness of the real awareness, with the others doing likewise, and the woman leader doing whatever she was. There was rather a shift felt in the temple, and then the impression of the presence of all these creatures. The impressions became more tangible, and then I could hear them as they scuttled about, and feel them when they scampered over my body. For these creatures seemed to be sentient and intelligent enough individuals, and even though their body forms seemed relatively small, like the size of dogs, say, they were body types where free will decision is established, a body form where they are personal self-deciding, unlike an animal which is simply making sense, being real, and has that connection with the real awareness that animates it. Their body types were very diverse in structure and design, but overall they were insect-like. Initially, they were a little suspicious overall, inquisitive and curious, however, as a few poked and prodded us as we lay. But we seemed to gain their trust, as though they could determine our sincerity, and more so as we remained standing in our real awareness, aside from the funny attitudes of the personal self. They did seem to be telepathic, and with a degree of awareness also that they could use for determining intent. With these insect beings established in the temple, able to breach the dimensional barrier, we would get to our feet and engage with these creatures. For yes, they were fully capable of speech. I can't quite recall their appearances, of such an unusual nature that my personal self had no point of reference, but the overall sense, as I said, was insectoid. What we spoke about was lost to my personal self on waking, but I presume we were establishing a contact with another dimensional form of life, orchestrated by the real guide, for more agreement that will benefit the whole of life. We are continuing then to go the length and breadth of creation, throughout all the dimensional aspects of it, leaving no real side stone unturned, as we seek out all the various species and attempt to bring them around and onto their next step of becoming more aware, etc. As, of course, the more individuals that step into their real awareness, the more there is an offsetting of the simulator demise, a demise through the overall created consciousness of the personal self's agreement, through the overall created consciousness of the personal self's agreement to restriction, consciously and predominantly subconsciously.
Yeah, without the simulator, we really don't know where we are. So we need the simulator to see what's not real, which we always talk about. So through comparison, we see what's real, which is an interesting way to look at life and the way things are. Most people think belief, faith, hope, their ideas or something, that it's actually by seeing what doesn't work, what's not real, you can see what's real. It's sort of you have to tweak things a bit to see what that is, see what that means. And then you talked about frequencies, which reminded me of the old Tartarians that had these fantastic, purportedly they're the ones that built these fantastic cathedrals with the huge organs, and you'd stand in the middle of these organs, huge, they were huge, and some of the huge organs that still exist in Europe, they were supposedly healing centers, these cathedrals, plus you turn them or play the organ to a certain frequency, and then you could transport, they're transporting systems through portals in different dimensions through certain frequencies that they knew about. So like tuning areas, you could tune the frequencies for health or for transportation, etc. And there was this guy that did an experiment with a tuning fork. He'd have two tuning forks together, and he'd do one, and then the other, without touching it, would also correspond to the one that he was scratching. And then he quit doing the tuning fork, and then the other one would keep going. So it's like frequencies affect each other, and they can be used for a lot of different things that people don't really see anymore. And the music, of course, hertz has been changed. The sound per second, now it's discordant, whereas it used to be more in harmony with nature, etc. So these are all this is purposely done, the frequencies and the things that are going on now to disrupt and to distort nature and our minds, our bodies, etc. This is all purposely being done. So frequency is very interesting study and something anybody could look into. Well, we still have the internet and still some freedom there. We're doing our research. So thanks, Kevin. Anything you want to end with?
With our body vehicles being an electromagnetic frequency field of a certain vibration, it obviously corresponds with whatever life level that particular body vehicle affects into. So obviously then, if you change the frequency of your body vehicle or something changes it, it's then going to, obviously, if you change the body vehicle and it's no longer in alignment with the particular dimensional life level it is designed for, it cannot then exist in that life level. And so that would be the basis of how you would transport through dimensions. You change the body form, overall electromagnetic energy field, it must then remove it from the dimension it was designed for. And so that would probably be how those fireplaces operated. They must have changed the frequency in the body that allowed that transportation to occur. And it was quite interesting as well, because I had a real side experience I shared not so long ago, where in regards to these giant trees, and I was shown how these giant trees served a similar purpose for transportation possibilities, in that there was a far greater, back in the so-called past, of a far greater connection between humans and the natural environment, and including these giant trees, and such that not only could individuals almost download all the information contained in the consciousness of the tree, so the tree is then represented almost a living record of what has transpired on the earth that could be tuned into and determined. But also there was such a connection between these giant trees in particular and people, that there was some ability, there was some method by which that the individuals could almost align themselves with the tree, and the tree could somehow facilitate their transportation into other dimensions in the same way as the Tartarian fireplaces. So it suggests there was a far greater interconnectedness between nature and humans that had such situations available, in which that people would literally go to these giant trees, and they would, whatever their methodology, then they would connect in with them, and almost the trees would facilitate their ability to dimensionally transport themselves by again altering their body frequency states to allow that to take place. And that was, I suggest, a reason why they probably chopped down these giant trees, because they obviously wanted to limit people far more so. They wanted to obviously negate their ability to possibly travel in this way. But also, if these trees do contain, as they do, a lasting memory record of all that's occurred on the planet, and to this day, people are able to attune to trees and access this information. And if you're talking about trees, these giant trees, which would be hundreds of thousands of years old, if they were still alive today, they would have a record of exactly what had happened on the planet Earth, irrespective of the nonsense that we're fed by the controllers. And so they certainly don't want people to be able to access that information, which would obviously be contradictory to that which they are spewing forth. And and so I just thought I'd add that.
Yeah, and then opening up your frequency through nature to see the little elves and gnomes and dwarfs and little spirits, I mean, that are all around, but it's just that they're at a different frequency. So the more in tune you are with this nature world, more access you have. So there again, we're going into the technology here, that we're getting away from what is nature and what supports us into this other area where now we are being supported by something distorted, and that's what the controllers want. So we market the environment. Basically, we market clean air, clean food, clean water, and what that means. It's not just physical on the physical level, but there's a lot more to the environment than just clean air, clean food, clean water. It can take you more, like we're talking about, more into other dimensions and levels, which just can expand your awareness to where you have more access to becoming even greater, more possibilities into exploring the real universes. Thanks again, Kevin. Okay. New you.
New